Hey, this is Jesse with createthis. You might have taken a look at part one of this series on the Hackintosh. And if you did, then you might have seen some of the comments down below in the video. Some of you commented that because I'm not using an SSD for storage, my video editing is going to be much slower than if I were using an SSD. I'm not an expert. I'm just a hobbyist, but my benchmarks and testing don't seem to indicate that video editing in Final Cut Pro 10 is dependent so much on disk throughput with an SATA 6 connection as it is with CPU throughput. And so I would like to run a series of tests where I take a standard snippet, and we'll just go ahead and pull this up here. So this is just a little clip from the part one video where I'm talking about all of the, the hardware here. So I'm going to take this snippet and I'm going to render it out to 1080p. And as I do that, I'm going to have a timer available here, and we're going to record how long this takes in minutes and seconds. Then we're going to do the same thing. So this is going to the Seagate 3 terabyte drive, right? So this is like an internal hard drive, SATA 6, 3 terabyte, not an SSD, it's a magnetic drive, okay? Then we're going to take the SSD drive, it's a 120 gigabyte SSD drive, internal also, also SATA 6, and we're going to run the same clip on the SSD drive and export it to the SSD drive as 1080p. And we're going to see if there's any difference in time. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm just going to go to Share, and I've got a number of little presets here, like up to 4K. That's like a YouTube export setting. I use this thing called Compressor. I don't think you have to use Compressor. I really don't find any, there's nothing great about Compressor in my opinion, except that it lets you tweak some of the output settings like your bit rate and things like that. So I use Compressor. These are all my Compressor settings. For these two tests, we're just going to use HD 1080p. That is not the fastest setting that I could use. I could use this up to 4K fast 15 Mbps setting, and that's like a single pass setting, right? So that's faster than this because this is a multi-pass setting. But it doesn't matter. We're just going to use the same setting for both exports, okay? So as soon as I'm done clicking the next button here and selecting everything, I'm going to start my timer. So there's going to be, plus or minus a second or two as I tab over to the timer app, but we'll get a pretty accurate reading here, okay? So let's do this. All right, so I don't want to export to the desktop for this one. This one's going to the Seagate 3 terabyte drive. And before we do this, let's just verify that this data is actually stored on the Seagate drive. Yeah, so you can see location, Seagate 3 terabyte. Okay, so that confirms that this is actually on the Seagate drive, and we're going to be exporting to the Seagate drive. Okay, so I'm just going to click Save here, Replace, and I'm going to swap over to my timer and start that puppy up. Oh, it says it was successful already, so I must not have cleared my cache. Let me go ahead and do that. So we're going to delete our generated files here. Okay. And we're going to quit Final Cut Pro. I'm going to go back into Final Cut Pro. I'm going to reset my timer while we're doing that. Okay. And just, for some baseline CPU measurements, the timer draws 15% of one CPU, 17%. So it does draw something. But for the most part, we're pretty low, 2%, 96% idle, okay? So share, 1080p, next. Save and start my timer. Okay. Now I'm gonna just speed this up through the magic of editing. You know, this happens in real time and I'm recording it in real time, but I'm gonna speed it up so you can see the results quicker. The one thing that I will say about this is I'm using this Line In app to record my mic because I'm recording all of this on a laptop through a Game Capture HD. So the video for this video that I'm taking is being recorded externally from the Hackintosh. It's actually being recorded to my laptop. But I didn't have enough ports to run my external hard drive on my laptop and the Game Capture HD, so I'm having to run my audio through the Hackintosh. So that'll affect our times a little bit because I'm sure that takes up some CPU, but it's not horrible, and I'll try to talk, you know, the same amount for each one. One other thing that I'll look at here, so you can see that Final Cut Pro is using 425% CPU, so that to me tells me that it's chewing up the CPU fairly consistently, right? We are not using a ton of memory or processor on my GTX 970, which is what we're using right now. And this is not the card in part one. This is not the graphics card that I used in part one. This is the one that I upgraded to, so it's a much better card. If we look at our disk stats, we can see that the Seagate drive is indeed using the disk, 2 megabyte throughput, read, looks like 1 megabyte, 1.6 megabyte write. So we are indeed using the disk, and I'm using a program called iStatMenu to view this statistical information. I think I've got some time here. I can actually just pull up the Intel Power Gadgets. So you can see this is a 4 gigahertz CPU with, I don't know, it overclocks to like, or it turbos to like 4.4 gigahertz or something like that. And so it's almost entirely utilized. We should be done any second now. Looks like the additional CPU that I'm using for the mic and the Intel Power monitor might be bumping up the amount of time that it takes. Okay, so 6:34 was our time. In my previous tests, without any of the audio recording hardware attached or anything, or the Game Capture HD on the HDMI port, I was getting 6:11. So 6:34. That's a little slower. Now let's see how the SSD fares. So the next test that we're gonna clear our cache first. That way Final Cut Pro renders everything again. And we're gonna quit Final Cut Pro. And we're probably gonna have to do this twice. Okay, and I'm gonna open up my library for testing the SSD. And I'm going to close the library for testing the magnetic hard drive. Now again, let's take a look at this. This is stored on the El Capitan drive, which is indeed my SSD drive. Okay. Let's delete the cache, just to be sure. And we'll restart. Okay. So this is going to be rendering from the SSD to the SSD, okay? Make sure I've got my timer pulled up. And just put that on the desktop. Replace. Seems like every time I do that replace thing, it doesn't like it. So let's try getting rid of that file first. Again, I did this once before I recorded to prove that to myself that it was going to work. I'll just delete these generated files first. I don't know if I need to or not, but I will anyway. Okay, let's try this again. So again, from the SSD to the SSD. All right, got kind of a late start on that one, so maybe add 2 or 3 seconds to it. I'll just go through the same rigmarole that we went through last time. So looking at the CPU, we can see Final Cut Pro is using 420% CPU. Memory isn't that much on the graphics card, neither is the processor on the graphics card. Looking at the disk throughput, in this case, the Seagate drive is 0 KB and 0 KB because we're not using it. The SSD is 1.5 megabytes per second read, 1.5 megabytes per second write. Just to be consistent, I will go ahead and pull up the Intel Power Monitor gadget. You can see it's using about the same amount of CPU that the previous one used, about 4.2 gigahertz. By the way, the Intel Power Monitor and iStat menus, these are both free programs. Close that and we'll just wait, see what happens. By the way, I will have a link to the original video, the original Hackintosh build, down below in the description. So if you're curious what hardware I'm using for these tests, I have every piece of hardware that I bought listed in the description of that video, not this video. So feel free to click through and check that out. All right, and we're approaching where, in my testing before making the video, where the SSD and the hard drive both came to 611. So we got 634 last time. We'll see what we get on this run. There you go. So 631 with the SSD, and the magnetic drive scored 634, I believe. So very, very close. You know, nothing really. I mean, I think that's within the margin of error, especially considering that I'm running USB audio through the box that's also doing the transcoding, the Hackintosh. I think that's probably going to do nothing for the performance. It probably hurts it a little bit. And I've been running all of these CPU expensive power monitors and disk monitors and CPU monitors and stuff like that. So I would call that a tie, pretty much. If you want to split hairs about it, go right ahead. Anyway, so again, I'm a hobbyist. These are the results that I'm finding on my Hackintosh. If you notice that I'm doing something wrong, or if you think of something that I can try, by all means, let me know. I mean, it seems to me from my testing that SSDs and magnetic hard drives are kind of the same as far as rendering out an entire video file goes. Now, as I was sitting here thinking about it, I thought of one final test that we can do. Why don't we render from the SSD to the magnetic drive? Let's see what that does. So I'm going to clear out my cache again. I would expect this bit to be a little bit faster if, and only if, our bottleneck is not the CPU. And again, this is an i7 4790K CPU, so it's like, at the time of this filming, it's pretty much the fastest CPU that you can put into a Mac, into a Hackintosh. I don't know if they make quad CPU motherboards anymore, but if they made a quad CPU motherboard, you could probably get way better performance out of this. All right, let's see. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to render. And actually, let me delete the files on the hard drive first. For some reason, when I don't do that, it complains, or it like treats them like they're cached or something. All right. So let's see. So this time we're going to save this to the Seagate hard drive. So we're going from the SSD to the Seagate hard drive. Get my timer ready. Okay, this should be interesting. I've never done this test before. So same CPU utilization from Final Cut Pro, 410 to 420%. Memory and processor, I'm seeing a little more processor utilization on the GeForce, but you know, still fairly minimal. As far as the disks go, we're seeing pretty much what we would expect. We're seeing 1.5 megabytes per second read on the SSD, and we're seeing 1 megabyte or 1.5 megabytes per second write on the Seagate magnetic hard drive. I'll just shut up and let this test run. We'll go ahead and look at memory utilization here too, just as a kind of a talking point. So we're only using about, I don't know, looks like 6 gigabytes tops, right? And this machine has 32 gigabytes installed. I know when I built it, it only had 16, but I've since upgraded it. So you really only need 5 or 6 to run Final Cut Pro successfully. Anything else is really just kind of overkill. So 16 would be more than enough. Okay, so 632. I mean, again, our other two were 634 and 631. So 632, in my opinion, is within the margin of error. It doesn't seem to be appreciably faster to run from the SSD to the external or to the internal magnetic hard drive. So to me, from what I'm seeing here, the CPU appears to be the bottleneck. I think when the new Skylake processors get some Mac support, when we start running those Skylake processors, we're going to see video editing times decrease. Again, if you can find, I haven't done any research, so I have no idea if they even make them, but if you can put 4 i7 4790K CPUs on one motherboard and utilize all of them for Final Cut Pro, then you could probably get shorter render times that way as well. So, but as far as I can tell, does it matter whether you render to an SSD or not? No, I don't think so. I think the CPU is the bottleneck. So this is Jesse with Create This. If you have any comments for me, leave them down below. I read everything, and I'd be happy to debate things with you. Maybe your comment will even inspire the next video for Create This. So thanks for watching, and please subscribe.